Oh, come on, there we go. Okay, so time to go. As I say, it's time to get out of Dodge, or in this case, Mitzrayim, get out of Egypt. It's time to come to the end. How long were we in Egypt?
Oh, that's 430 years.
430? Well, wait.
It says so right in the beginning.
Who was the first person to get to Egypt? Who are we counting from?
First, Joseph.
What?
We counting from
Are
Joseph.
we counting? Is this from Joseph then?
Or
Or
are we counting when his father brought the tribes
or
down?
do we do it with Jacob plus the 70, or
Right.
including in the 70, Jacob the 70, when they came down? Well, we weren't actually slaves then, but we were there then. So let's we'll just call it 400 approximately for the moment. If we say we were in Egypt for 400 years, if that was either from Joseph or from Jacob in the 70, then we weren't slaves for that whole time, were we?
No, we were not.
Is that, well, wait. But I thought the whole point of our being in Egypt for so long was that we were slaves. But this number can't be 100% slavery.
Well, part of it was because of the famine, so they couldn't go back to Canaan because there was no food there. So
Well,
you had to stay in Egypt for a while.
Well, yeah, but that means it was good in Egypt. It was better than we've already been. Going to
Until-
Egypt was an improvement.
Until a Pharaoh arose who forgot all about Joseph. But
Okay,
until
so there's
then-
some fraction of this,
Yeah.
right? That is slavery, and some fraction of it is good times.
Yep.
So when we say after 400 years we left, why give the total amount? If part of it was good, shouldn't we just say after X number of years of slavery we were set free? Why say that it's the cumulative amount that is coming to an end?
Unless you think that Israel is the land we're supposed to be in anyway, because it's promised us by God,
Mhm.
and exile from our homeland, even if it's good, is like we live here in America, but we know that Israel is the land that we eventually aspire to be in.
Okay, so if being in Egypt at all is a problem, then good or bad,
Right.
the total is what is coming to an end, and that's when we're leaving. And also because we were told that we were going to be here. Anybody remember that? All right, let's do the story in context, and then we will return to the beginning. And we're going to see that this whole 400 idea is embedded in something more than just the end. That the 400 is actually a bookend to something that was mentioned much, much earlier in the book of Genesis. But we'll get back to that. Well, let's get to our story now. At the end of this time period, I will leave it ambiguous for the moment, and then we will back up and do it the other way. So we're going to be looking in Parashat Bo, Exodus 12, chapter 12, and verse 29 to begin. That's page 387 if you are in the Eitz Chaim Chumash. It's some other page if you are in a different Chumash. But Exodus 12, verse 29. At the very top of the page, conveniently. And Harriet, I see you already volunteering. Thank you.
In the middle of the night, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And Pharaoh arose in the night with all his courtiers and all the Egyptians, because there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was no house where there was not someone dead. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, "Up, depart from among my people, you and the Israelites with you. Go, worship the Lord as you said. Take also your flocks and your herds as you said, and be gone. And may you bring a blessing upon me also."
All right, so part of the story that most of us are very familiar with, right? The final plague comes, the 10th plague, the striking of the firstborn, and in the aftermath of this catastrophe, Pharaoh finally says, go. Remember all this? Yes?
Yes.
Sound familiar?
Yes.
Good. And so, this is also going to sound familiar, I imagine.
The Egyptians urged the people on, impatient to have them leave the country, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls wrapped in their cloaks upon their shoulders. The Israelites had done Moses' bidding and borrowed from the Egyptians objects of silver and gold and clothing. And the Lord had disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people, and they let them have their request. Thus, they stripped the Egyptians.
All right, so we get simultaneously the matzah as well as the fulfillment of what we're going to talk about a little bit later, the idea that when we leave, we're not going to be going out empty-handed. And by the way, this is going to be something that will be codified by Jewish law, that when someone has been a servant for a number of years, when they are let free during the Jubilee or sabbatical, they are given gifts to go in peace. So it's not just a full frontal robbery here.
The word that was used was they borrowed.
Yes.
The borrowing.
And now, isn't that present day? They say, hey, you know the stuff you borrowed
Yes.
all those years ago? Well, we want it back with interest.
Yeah,
They did
well,
file lawsuits.
so yeah, and the Israelites filed lawsuit for back wages. So yeah, if there are people who there are some people who do it seriously because they are lunatics, and some people who do it seriously because it's tongue in cheek. And I've seen both varieties.
And there was just a whole large group of stripped naked Egyptians standing around.
Well, it's a symbol for the amount of
Amount of
loot
Yeah,
that was taken out with us. But the idea here is very important, that if you remember when we began talking about this whole idea of the Exodus, is that we could have left at any point if we had had the strength, if we had had the willingness. We could have left at any point if the Egyptians had recognized the rightness of our claim and had asked us to leave or offered to let us leave. But in the end, we are leaving in exactly the way that God had predicted we would leave, which is to say that we would go out, and we would go out with dignity and strength rather than creeping through the night. And that's what's happening. We are striding out of Egypt rather than scuttling.
The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from children. Moreover, a mixed multitude went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had taken out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, since they had been driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves.
Okay, so we've got 600,000 adults, adult men, that is to say of battle age. It's the usual interpretation, and we get a refined number when we get to the census taking, plus the the mixed multitude that go along with us, and then you of course have to probably multiply that by 2 or 3 or so to get the actual number of people, probably closer to 3. So we're looking at probably somewhere in the order between 2 and 3 million people. We're going to come back to that, but keep that number in mind. Yeah, to say that is a lot of people is an understatement, right? It's it's a very interesting number that we will have to wrestle with. But here comes our big number in verse 40.
The length of time that the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430th year, to the very day, all the ranks of the Lord departed from the land of Egypt. That was for the Lord a night of vigil to bring them out of the land of Egypt. That same night is the Lord's, one of vigil for all the children of Israel throughout the ages.
And we call that night now
Passover.
Pesach, right? So this is the night when we have our Seder in commemoration of this moment. All right, so we got a number. What's the number? 430. Okay, but 400 seemed like a reasonable number. Why would you possibly be thinking of the number 400? Why would you possibly be thinking of that number?
Earlier, it said 3 people.
Okay, so going back to Genesis 15, and you're welcome to flip back if you would like. Genesis 15, we have the quote here from our text, but if you want to see the full version, Genesis 15, we are on page number 84. So you can either read from the prepared text or from the Chumash, either is fine. But
And he said to Abraham, know,
to Avram,
oh, to Avram, of course, know of a surety that your seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years.
okay, so there's your 400.
Yeah.
When God appeared to Moses at this time, he gave him a prophecy that his children would be strangers in a land not of their own, and that their time in that land would be 400 years. And now we are leaving Egypt 430 years. Was God lying?
No.
They shall.
Afflicted for 400 years.
Okay, so
It's only 30 years of good times.
so maybe it was 30 for good and 400 for slavery, perhaps, right? And by the way, if you go on and look on verse 14, I will execute judgment on the nation that they serve, and in the end they shall go free with great wealth. That is the prophecy that then gets fulfilled by the Israelites leaving with the treasures of the Egyptians. So all of the parts seem to fit. The numbers, though, there are still some problems with. Well, because if we're saying that there were 30 years, the difference between these two numbers is 30 years of good time, meaning from Jacob coming down, we know he lived there for at least 17 years and maybe another 13 years, things were still okay. And then there were 400 years of slavery. That would mean we need 400 years worth of living in the land of Egypt, right, to make that work. But we have some pretty good evidence that we didn't live there 400 years. Read.
Is that the genealogy?
The genealogies.
And the sons of Levi who went down to Egypt were Gershon, Kahath, and Merari.
Okay, and then from the beginning of near Exodus.
And the sons of Kahath were Amram, Izhar, Hebron, and Uziel. And the years of Kahath's life were 133 years.
Okay, so we've got this line that's beginning to form here. Are we noticing this? Right? We have Levi who went down to Egypt, and with Levi, there was Gershon, Kahat, and Merari. Right? These are the different Levite clans. And then from Kahat, we see there's a guy named Amram, and Izhar, and Hebron, and Uziel, right? And that is the son of Levi. Right? Let's make sure we got the genealogy here. Right? We got Levi, begat. Everybody loves that word,
Yeah.
right? And then we go to the next part of the genealogy.
For Kahath was among those who went down to Egypt. Now, calculate all his years and the years of Amram, his son, and the 80 years of Moshe, and you will find that they do not total 400 years. Many of the son's years are included in the father's years.
All right, so this is Rashi's comment, which is trying to draw our attention to the issue. All right, the issue is Levi can't count as part of the 400 his whole life because he was born long before everybody went down to Egypt. Kahat, we were just told, was among the ones that went down to Egypt, right? He was there with his father going down to Egypt. So at least some of his years were not Egypt years. Amram and Moses, well, we know by the end of 80 years of Moses' life, we're going free. So Moses is our finale. We know we got 80 years here. That would mean that some part of Kahat's life through Amram's life would have to equal 320 years in order for the 400 years to begin to make sense. Does that make sense? We see the math issue here?
Yeah.
Right? And if you add up the actual years of life that is recorded in the Torah for both Kahat and for Amram, we got, 133 and 137. And 133 plus 137 is?
270.
So at the most, we've got 270, which is at least 50 years short. And that would only be if Kahat gave birth to Amram on his death day. And then Amram gave birth to Moses on his death day. We would still be 50 years too short. Right, that's what Rashi's pointing out by saying you will find that in total 400 years, and many of the son's years are included in the father's years. What he means by included is overlap, right? Just because you had a kid doesn't mean you died. I know there are people who seem to think that, but just because you have a kid doesn't mean your life is over. And we hope that a parent and a child will coexist for lots and lots of years. But even if they didn't, right? Even if we were to imagine Kahat giving birth and Amram giving birth on their last day of life, we are still short on this count. And we have a genealogy from Levi to Moses that tells us very, very clearly, who's where, right? So we can't imagine people coming in between. Right? We can't add extra generations in. We can't say, oh, well, actually, between Kahat and Amram, there was another 5 generations of people. Because we are given the genealogy very, very explicitly for Moses to go back to Levi in 1, 2, 3, 4 steps. So we're kind of stuck. And we're not the first ones to notice this. Right? Our sages have tackled this in the past. So onward with Rashi's summary.
That will be that they dwelled
Yes.
in Egypt after the other dwellings in which they dwelled as foreigners in a land that was not theirs.
Okay, so what is Rashi doing here? He's taking that quote from chapter 15 in Genesis and saying, you have your hand up, sorry.
No, not at all. They dwelled in Egypt.
Right?
They dwelled in other places as well as
Okay.
they left Canaan.
Not just as they left Canaan.
Canaan is another. Oh,
Did we ever take ownership of all of Canaan?
no.
Right? When we were in the land of the Philistines and when we were going down to Egypt and back to Egypt and all sorts of other things, that was also included as foreign land. So what Rashi's doing here is by explaining in the words of the Midrash, which we're going to go into more detail in a second, we normally assume that the 400 and 430 years that are mentioned both at the end of the Exodus, or I guess the beginning of the Exodus, the end of our Egyptian time, the beginning of our leaving, and during the prophecy to Abraham, we normally imagine that that's all 100% Egypt time. And what Rashi is saying is no, our classical sages said no. We had more time that the counter, I'm trying to think of like the taxi cab, right? The meter, that's the word. The meter was running before we crossed the border into Egypt. And so we were adding up years long before these guys came on the scene.
So when did the meter start running?
Ah, excellent question. Please read.
Okay. So the phrase was 430 years. Altogether, from the time that Isaac was born until now, were 400 years. From the time that Abraham had seed, Genesis 15:13 was fulfilled. And there were another 30 years from the decree between the parts in Genesis 10 until Isaac was born.
All right, so what's the 430? The 430 is from the prediction to the fulfillment. The 400 is the actual amount of time from when Isaac was born. Your offspring, your seed, will be strangers, right? Because that's what the prophecy is about. From the time Isaac was born to the time we leave is 400. Because from the time that God told Abraham this is going to happen to the time Abraham had Isaac, which is when the meter starts running, there were 30 years. Does that make sense? Right? So we end up with both 400 and 430 fitting fine if you accept the rabbinic interpretation that our time in Egypt wasn't 400. Our time of being a stranger was 400. Of Abraham's offspring being a stranger was 400. And for Abraham's offering to be a stranger, you have to start with his first offspring. And his first offspring of part of the covenant is Isaac. So we start the meter running at Isaac, and the math that we're going to see will work out much better, much more relaxed than trying to make people having babies when they're 133 and 137 at just the last moment of their life, right? And we don't need to worry about those missing 50 years. So I just want to make sure that we all understand what they're doing. Yeah.
Well, you could actually add 9 months after that.
Well, you could give a 9-month cushion, but that's still not going to fill in 50 years. That would be a really long gestation. If it was, and then for 25 years, she was pregnant. Yocheved would have been really upset. 25 years of pregnancy. That would be upsetting.
But
Okay.
back in Bereshit, it says, God says to Abraham, to Avram,
Mhm.
they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years.
Ah, okay. So now we have to deal with the oppression part, right? Because, okay, we can see how the count is going to work. Actually, why don't we go ahead and just go ahead and take a look on the back page of the chart. This might help a little bit. So if you look at the chart that I tried to put together there, and by the way, the dates on the side are approximate. We don't have timestamps for all of them, but these should give you a rough idea of one way of counting. Then the covenant between the pieces, that's the covenant with Abraham where he gets the image of his people, of his offspring being strangers in a land. That is when the count begins. That's when our 430 clock starts ticking, right? Isaac is born 30 years later. Okay, now we are counting down the 400 that was in his prophecy, right? The 430 is in Exodus as being the fulfillment. The 400 is the beginning of the actual prophecy being fulfilled because now he has offsprings with which it can be fulfilled. Okay, that was a long sentence. Does that make sense? Maybe? Okay. Then Israel comes to Egypt in around 1523 BCE, right? And that would then leave us 210 years to go before we actually get out of Egypt. And the enslavement, according to another midrash, only began at 116 years before the exit. Levi was the last of the brothers to die, and it was only when the final brothers of the 12 tribes died that the Egyptians began to turn us and enslave us. There's another midrash, by the way, very interesting, that says Ephraim, one of the other tribes, they left early because they were counting from the original prophecy, giving, rather than when the prophecy kicked in. And so they were off by 30 years. But the most important date that we got to have here at the end is that the Exodus happens in 1313, 430 years on the nose from when God first told Abraham, your offspring will be enslaved. How's that for math? Okay. Let's go ahead and take one more text on the first page, the Rashi text there at the bottom, where it is impossible.
It is impossible, however, to say that they spent 400 years in Egypt alone. You are compelled to say that the other dwellings which the patriarchs settled were also called sojourns, and even in Hebron, as it is said, where Abraham and Isaac sojourned. And it states also the land of their sojourns in which they sojourned. Therefore, you must say that the prophecy, your seed will be strangers, starts when he, Abraham, had offspring. And only when you count 400 years from the time that Isaac was born, you will find 210 years from their entry into Egypt.
All right, so in terms of in slavery and oppression, what we're talking about then is both the hard labor type slavery that we see in the Exodus story, but also the harshness with which our ancestors had to deal with the other occupants of the land. The way that Jacob was intimidated by the people of Shechem, the way that Abimelech intimidated Isaac, and the way that overall our ancestors had to struggle with many of the other people of the land during this time period. So the enslavement, the harsh treatment began gradually at different times under different people. And remember, it was only quite late in the game that the Egyptians finally said, whoa, these Israelites, they're a problem. Let's deal with them harshly. Oh, look, they're still a problem. Let's start killing people. Oh, look, now they want to leave. Let's make them actually collect the straw as well. There was a escalation of the treatment. which means you don't have to always look at the worst as being the only time of enslavement or the only time of oppression. Make sense? Not so bad? And then our last sentence here, which is going to give us a little head scratch.
This is one of the things that the sages changed for King Ptolemy.
Okay, they changed for King Ptolemy? Mise? Is it me? Anyone know who King Ptolemy was? The Ptolemaic Empire. Egypt. Well, it was the Egyptian portion.
Alexander the Great.
After Alexander the Great, the Egyptian portion of his empire became known as the Ptolemaic Empire after his general Ptolemy, who took over that section upon his death. And why are we making things for the king? The Septuagint. The translation of the Torah into Greek was said to be done at the king's demand. And he took 70 sages and he put them in 70 rooms and he asked them all to write a translation, and they were all the same. Right? And if you've ever tried to translate a single sentence, the idea that 70 guys would translate the entire Torah all the same is fairly miraculous. And indeed, it's one of the reasons why the Greek translation of the Torah is the only other version of the Torah that you can read from in the sanctuary and say a bracha over. You can actually read from a scroll in Greek just as well as you can read from Hebrew. No one does, but it is possible. It is officially halakhically permissible to read from a Greek Torah scroll. Yeah, it's Greek to me, exactly. I'm much more comfortable with Hebrew than I am with Greek. So I'm glad that most of our congregations don't do that, but for a long portion of Jewish history, there were many Jews who were more comfortable with Greek than Hebrew, and that was a blessing. And the idea here is, although our version of the Septuagint doesn't quite match what Rashi's talking about, was that in order to avoid our confusion, when they translated it to say that there would be 400 years, so that there wouldn't be this disconnect between what happened in the prophecy with Abraham and the fulfillment of the prophecy. So what Rashi is saying is that, at least in the versions he's seen, this had gotten smoothed over in the Septuagint translation, so that people who weren't familiar with our traditions of interpretation and explanation wouldn't be confused by, well, all of this. Make sense? Maybe. But we've just made ourselves a new problem. Okay, so today's all about numbers. Because what we just did was we said, don't worry, there wasn't really 430 years of living in Egypt. It was actually only 210 years of living in Egypt. But that's a problem. "210 years of living in Egypt, according to the traditional interpretation, by starting the clock at Isaac rather than starting the clock at Jacob. 210 years. You got 70 guys, right? 70 people that come down to Egypt. They have to get to 3 million in 210 years.
And you can subtract the mixed multiple.
Oh, let's take off the riffraff. Okay,
Okay.
fine, good point. Much better. I feel better too. In 70 years, if you were to take 70 colonists and put them down on a deserted island, after 210 years, you should expect there to be 2 million. Everybody's having trouble with this?
Yeah.
Conversions?
Conversions.
Conversion.
Yeah.
Well, it's.
Because
you
I mean,
have food,
to be honest though,
water.
to be honest, if you went from the 400, it still would be impossible to reach 2 million people out of 70 in this amount of time. Out of 70, and remember, according to the tradition, of course, both by Egyptian culture and our own, we were not exactly making a whole bunch of converts. This is 70 people breeding themselves into 2 million, not 70 people attracting 2 million adherents.
It's not really 70 if you're talking about taking a couple to have a child,
Mm-hmm.
then you're really dealing with half the number.
somewhere around that. I mean, because we have a few women mentioned, as well as the rest of the tribes and their heads of their clans. But even if we had 70 that had another magical 70 to work with,
Okay.
it's just how fast, how many generations, because we know how many generations, right? We know Levi, and we know who his kids were, right? So really, we only get like 4 kids out of him. And then we get from him, 4 offshoots. But for each of them, we've only got 2 more blanks before we're at Moses. Remember, 1, 2, 3, 4 generations to go to Moses. So you can't even say, well, maybe they had kids really, really super fast, and they were having babies when they were 12, and then as soon as they were 12, they had more babies and more babies and more.
Triplets too.
Well, and you can say maybe they were each having puppies, 8 to 10 babies per birth. I mean,
the mothers were 80 years old.
the math doesn't work. I didn't have room on the page, but there's a very long and good analysis by the commentator Shadal that basically says there's nothing in the world that makes this make sense. There's no way to get from 70 to 2 million by any mechanic of nature that is possible. Now, some answers that do range that say, don't worry, it's a miracle, right? Indeed, they were having 13 babies a pregnancy. and you can almost kind of get there by having multiple 13 baby pregnancies. And perhaps that would explain why the Egyptians were a little freaked out by us. So it's like, look at them. They're having 13 kids every 5 years. That's incredible.
And they don't use midwives.
And they don't need a midwife. Well, midwives would be overworked. How could they possibly take care of all of that? But that's not the only way we can preserve the text without trying to say the text is wrong. But preserve the text and preserve every possible physical law that we know from biology and resource development. Because I can tell you, 2 million people anywhere in the world at this time of history didn't happen. You did not have a 2 million person standing army or city or country that was big enough that you could all get up and move anywhere in the world, that you simply lacked the capacity, the technology to support and sustain that many people at any one time to work. Okay, so here's our problem. Our problem is the wonderful word Elef, which usually gets translated as 1,000. Open up your modern Hebrew dictionary and you look up the word Elef, it's going to be 1,000, right? And that is what the modern word means. However, its roots are not necessarily limited to the numerical number 1,000. So we're going to look at some examples. So we've got on the back page here under the little x equals Elef. So can you read the numbers one first?
Yes, but Moses said, "Here I am with 600,000 men on foot, and yet you say, I will give them meat to eat for a whole month."
Right, so again, our word Elef is the word that's being used here for 1,000, right? Shesh meot elef ragli, 600 elef regli. Now, ragli is the word for foot or leg, but it seems to be a unusual term. I mean, why not just say we've got 600,000 guys? Why use the term ragli? All right, well, let's take a look at the next one.
Now, Zevach and Salmuna were in Karkor with their army, about 15,000 men, all that remained of the entire army of the people from the east, since 120,000 sword-drawing men had fallen.
Right, Mea ve'esrim, again, our 120. Elef, we have 120 elef. Ish sholeach charev. Guys that draw the sword-drawing men. Okay, odd. Read the next one.
Shaul took 3,000 men chosen from all Israel and went searching for David and his men on the cliffs where the mountain goats are.
All right. Which you can, by the way, go visit even to this day.
Yes.
Wonderful part of a good Israel tour. Shloshet Elafim, there's our Elef again, but now in the plural form. Ish Bachur, chosen men, or chosen man, chosen guy. And by chosen here, we're talking about select troops, right? These are the elite, the commandos, if you will, of Saul's army. Do you notice a pattern from these three examples? Well, it doesn't just say 600,000 men. What gets added?
On foot.
On foot, sword drawing,
So-
chosen. These are military terms. 600,000 infantry, right? 600,000, or not 600,000, 120,000 swordsmen, right? And sword was a different category of soldier than spear, for example, all right? It was usually considered a more elevated status. Right? Swords had a lot more metal in them, therefore you didn't usually have a sword, you usually had a spear in this day and age. And chosen soldiers, the elite soldiers, the pick of the soldiers, the cream of the crop. The term Elef is often used as a military category. That doesn't necessarily have to mean a literal 1,000. Think of it as being like a squad. Right? The word Elef could just mean squad, with no attempt to give it a specific numerical value, which would mean these three passages would read that there were 600 squads of foot soldiers. There were 120 squads of swordsmen. There were 3 squads of select men, of choice troops. Seem plausible? Do those sentences still make sense? If you say there were 120 regiments, platoons, squads that were wiped out, there were 600, divisions of troops, of squads, of platoons, whatever you want to call it. And in America, platoon and squad all have numbers that go with them, but think of them as just sort of a generic category of, bundles of fighting guys. And indeed, we see in other places that the term, Alufei or Elef or Alufei, indeed doesn't necessarily mean numbers. So in Numbers 116,
These were the ones called from the assembly, the chiefs of their father's clan and heads of thousands in Israel.
okay, so again, it's tempting, and most of the translations do it, to translate the word Elef, or in here Alfei, because it's the compound form, as thousands. But what are we talking about in Numbers? We're talking about the census that is estimating the number of fighting men available, right? Because we are preparing to go into the land of Israel. We are preparing to settle the land and to fight for the land. And we are counting everybody in the army. We're not counting the old, we're not counting the young, we're not counting the women, because that wasn't who was in the army. We're just counting the guys who were able to schlep the weapons. And we're going to count the chiefs, right? And we're going to count the heads of the divisions, the heads of the squads, the platoons, the brigade, whatever you want to call it, the host, because that's what you need to know. You need to know how many guys you got to come to muster. And you're going to do that by counting the sergeants, the heads of each group that are going to show up, rather than necessarily counting each member of those groups. And some guys might have 50 people in their group. Some people might have 100 people in their group. Some people might have 10 people in their group. But how many groups do you have showing up was the way they measured. And indeed, the one place where we see the translation consistently not label it as thousands is when we talk about Esau's kids.
And it says, these are the chiefs of the sons of Esau.
Right? Ele alufei v'nei Esav. Again, alufei is from the same root, elef. And here it's explicitly translated by almost every translation I've ever seen as being chief or leader, right? These are the heads of thousands would be the other way to translate it, but they instead say, they're probably not talking numbers, they're just talking clan division.
In modern Hebrew, Elohim is general.
General.
Exactly right.
Just
And trust me, a general has more than 1,000 people under him in modern warfare, or at least, or more, depending upon how many stars you got up on your hat. So we have a tendency to get married to numbers because we like them, right? In all of the Torah, there are so many things that we have to interpret and expand upon and analyze and dissect, and we can only ever come to certain approximate truths. Numbers, we can count on numbers, right? When numbers speak, we know what a number means. But from both the examples we have today, they can't mean what they mean. If we say 430 years in Egypt, the numbers simply don't work for the process of our people being in Egypt and having that time, because you've only got 4 generations, one of which was already alive long before they went down, and one of which spends 80 years in it, which means you've got ridiculous life patterns for the 2 guys in the middle that still don't add up. And when you take that apart and you say, okay, you're right, so we can start from Isaac and that makes the math work, then you've only got 210 years to go from 70 people to 2 million. If you think you knew what that number meant and you're married to it because 1,000 sounds better than squad, make it squad and we're fine. Saying that we had 600 squads of fighting men makes perfect sense for our group coming out of Egypt as being both impressive and also being reasonable, right? 600 fighting, 600 squads, so maybe you've got 100 guys in each. That would be a big squad back in those days, right? That's 60,000 guys, right? So 60,000 guys, we're looking at maybe 120, maybe 200,000 people. That's still a huge mob. Probably even still a bit difficult to explain in terms of the logistics of moving and eating and drinking, but it's certainly possible. And you haven't changed a single part of the Torah. You haven't said the Torah was wrong. You haven't said someone made this up. You haven't said there's a scribal mistake here, or these are idealized fantasy numbers. You simply say, look, they were.
What was the population of Egypt at this time? I mean,
not 2 million. by archaeology, the population of Egypt was not 2 million.
That's what I.
Exactly. I mean, but again, there is an instinct sometimes to say, well, archaeology must be wrong, biology must be wrong, everything must be wrong, a miracle must have happened. And people will go to the greatest lengths to defend what they think is the true word. And I appreciate that sentiment and passion. But sometimes you just don't have the right word. Sometimes you're translating it in a way that you're making life difficult for yourself. And all you have to do is realize that an Aleph isn't always 1,000, but it can be something else. And it's so much easier to make sense of this, and to make sense of, in particular, how God describes us, which is our text from Deuteronomy, Harriet, if you'd read our final text.
Adonai, your God, is going to bring you into the land you will enter in order to take possession of it, and he will expel many nations ahead of you, the Hittite, the Girgashi, Emori, Canaani, Perezi, Hivi, and Yebusi, 7 nations bigger and stronger than you.
All of those nations are bigger and stronger than you. Keep going.
For you are a people set apart as holy for Adonai your God. Adonai your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his own unique treasure. At an Am Segula, we are a treasured people. Adonai did not set his heart on you or choose you because you numbered more than any other people. On the contrary, you were the fewest of all people. All right, so again, if you were trying to defend the 2 million number, you are completely running contradictory to this sentiment. Right? God doesn't say, you have so many people that this is amazing. God says, you're tiny. I took you out of Egypt and you were tiny when I took you out of Egypt, and yet I was able to protect you. You are now on the border of Israel and your numbers haven't changed. We've talked about that before. And you're still tiny. And these other nations that you are standing in front of, they are much bigger nations. They are big, they are powerful, they are settled, fortified walls, all that good stuff. You're still tiny, but it's okay. I'm with you. If you get 2 million people out here, we don't need God. We could have marched across the entire world with a 2 million person
force, or even 600,000 force.
Yeah.
And we could have conquered everything if we had an army that big compared to every other army in the world of the day.
And we're still tiny.
600,000 men of fighting age.
Yeah.
The other armies are maybe 10, 12,000.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Exactly.
In a fortified city, they wouldn't have been able to handle that.
No, we could have not just conquered Israel, we would have been able to conquer everything with
But we
a
didn't have to
600,000
worry about-
army.
Food or water or anything.
Well, I mean,
Well-
armies can be fielded like that, but it took us thousands of years to work out the systems of feeding armies like that. But we are talking with 600,000 armed men, we're talking more people or people under arms that were, rarely seen. You're talking about some of the Mongolian armies, maybe like on the edge of the realms of exaggeration. Some of the Napoleonic armies were getting up towards these numbers. What's that?
Not even that.
And it really wasn't until we got into the 20th century that you begin to see armies like this.
But even so, we are still tiny.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
this gives me hope that God really wants us to be this way, because that's why he'll still be on our side.
Well, not that he wouldn't be on our side if we had more.
We get too big. I mean, we're not as big as, I don't know, the United States or France or any of those countries. They're all way bigger than us.
Absolutely.
We're still very tiny,
And yet we still matter.
and yet we still matter.
Exactly. So there's this instinct with numbers that somehow we think bigger is better. Right? We like
Yeah.
bigger numbers. We like to feel important because our numbers are big. And this is telling us, A, God didn't pick us because we were big. And B, don't get carried away thinking the numbers are what's important, because in fact, every time we think numbers are important about ourselves and we think we're doing great by our numbers, that's when we hit the giant iceberg. Right? There's a reason why we are prohibited from taking a census directly in Judaism. And there's a reason why when we see people like David do take a census directly to figure out how much stuff he's got, meaning people, there's problems that come in the wake of that, right? Because the numbers are not supposed to be of major importance to us. And we're not supposed to think of ourselves as being big and mighty. We're supposed to think of ourselves as having a unique destiny. And yes, the children of Abraham do indeed number like the stars in the heaven. But as we've talked about also before, there aren't that many stars. We were already doing really well by star count. And that means, let the numbers serve the story. Don't make the story serve the numbers. Any other questions or comments? You guys are good at math.
Yeah.
When in our history did the accountants come in?
We had accountants, like I said, when we get a lot of math in the Torah, when they're doing the census and adding up all of these squads and divisions and numbers of people. But we eventually do get more clear accountants. Interestingly enough, this may just be a bit of an aside, but everybody know what we call the person who writes a Torah? In Hebrew, a sofer, which comes from the Hebrew word for counting. Right? Because the earliest forms of counting that were most important to us was you counted all the letters and you counted all the words, and that's how you knew you hadn't missed anything. Right? How do you proofread an entire Torah? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you get to the end, if you have the wrong number, you're missing a letter somewhere, or you added one in that you shouldn't have added. Right? So a sofer was called a sofer because that's what they did. They counted. They counted their words, they counted their letters to make sure they were accurate. So the accuracy was very, very important. But the number wasn't important. It was what the number represented, which was a faithful transmission and a faithful allegiance to the words, not just to the digits. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Rabbi, could I ask you something off the topic?
Of course. Let me just hit stop on the camera here.